In the heart of the valley, where the sun spilled gold across the rooftops and the marketplace bustled with traders, the town gleamed with prosperity. Merchants shouted their wares, barrels of grain clattered on wooden carts, and the scent of roasted yams mingled with the crisp, earthy smell of the river that ran nearby. On the surface, life seemed joyous, a dance of wealth and abundance. Yet beneath the laughter and clinking of silver, a shadow lingered, one born of envy, selfishness, and the quiet malice that human hearts can harbor. The rich facades of carved doors and polished floors hid secrets, and whispers curled through the alleyways like smoke. Among those living in the heart of this town was a young woman whose name was seldom spoken with warmth. Her hair, braided in intricate patterns, fell softly around her shoulders, framing eyes that reflected intelligence and quiet strength, yet a deep sorrow lingered there. She moved through her home and the streets with careful steps, never quite belonging anywhere, never fully acknowledged by the very family that should have cherished her. While the merchants and traders flaunted their treasures, she bore a different weight, the weight of being invisible in the eyes of those who should have loved her most. It was this same family that had conspired to sell her in secret, a decision driven not by need but by greed. Silver coins clinked in hidden pockets while her own future was weighed and measured against the gleaming metal. To the world, she was still their daughter, niece, or ward, but behind closed doors she had become a commodity, a transaction whispered about under the veil of night. No words of love or protection were offered, only the cold, calculating measures of human desire. The spirits that watched from the eaves and shadows seemed to murmur in disapproval, their whispers brushing the edges of the night with warnings that went unheeded. As merchants counted their silver and the town slept beneath lantern-lit windows, the young woman was led to a hidden chamber, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and secrecy. She felt the eyes of ancestors in the flicker of candlelight, watching the injustice that unfolded, noting each coin passed in exchange for her freedom, which she no longer possessed. Though her lips trembled, she made no sound. Fear and disbelief anchored her voice, and yet within her chest, a spark of defiance refused to die. The whispers of spirits seemed to brush against her mind, carrying silent admonitions. The world may bend to greed, but no act of cruelty goes unseen. In the town that thrived on wealth, the young woman's sale went unnoticed by neighbors and passers-by. To all who walked past the family's door, nothing seemed amiss, just another household tucked neatly into the row of sunlit homes, doors closed against the afternoon heat. But those shadows knew. The river that wound through the marketplace, the walls of the granaries, even the eaves of the rooftops, each held the memory of the betrayal. Greed had been served that night with silver on the tongue, and injustice had been dressed in the quiet smiles of a family willing to barter what was human for what was metal. And as she was taken away, the town remained oblivious, yet the wind carried the soft, mournful whispers of spirits watching over the innocent, marking the first moment in a story that would one day turn fire against the hands that betrayed her. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional creak of wooden beams and the rustle of leaves in the wind. The town lay still beneath the silver glow of the moon, its cobblestone streets empty, the marketplace deserted, and lanterns extinguished in the houses that slept soundly unaware of the darkness in their midst. Within one of the grander homes, a decision was being carried out with cold precision. The young woman, whose life had been reduced to a commodity, was the object of a transaction that would forever alter her fate. Her family, driven by lust for silver rather than necessity, had arranged for a buyer to come under the cover of darkness. The air inside the house was tense, thick with whispers that seemed louder than the wind outside. Each coin promised was weighed in secrecy, exchanged in hushed voices, as if the walls themselves might rebel against the injustice being plotted within them. The young woman's eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from face to face, searching for a hint of compassion, a sign that this was some cruel trick, but she found none. The smiles she saw were sharp, the words that accompanied them soft and chilling, crafted to hide their treachery in the delicate mask of civility. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum of warning, yet her lips could not form words. She had been raised to obey, yet never had she been instructed to obey this, the obedience of being sold. Her mind raced, grasping at a reality that seemed impossible. The silver coins, shining like stolen stars, were counted with meticulous care. Each coin that clinked against another seemed to hammer into her understanding that her value had been reduced to metal, that she was no longer daughter or sister, but an object to be exchanged. She recoiled inwardly, a shiver running down her spine, and a single tear threatened to escape, yet pride and fear kept it from falling. Outside, the streets remained quiet. No one witnessed the transaction. No neighbor peered through the windows, No passerby sensed the injustice unfolding behind closed doors. To the town nothing appeared amiss. The night carried no warnings in sound, no omens in the shadows that would reveal the betrayal. Some who would later hear whispers of the event dismissed it with a shrug, declaring that the girl had been cursed or that her destiny had been predetermined. Few dared to imagine that what had taken place was a deliberate act of greed, a moral corruption hidden in plain sight. The young woman's confusion and horror became a prison of their own. Each step she was forced to take toward her unknown future felt heavy, weighed down by betrayal. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she followed the men carrying her to the carriage waiting beyond the garden wall. The moonlight reflected off the silver, glinting cruelly, and she felt as though every coin carried a piece of her soul with it. Her thoughts turned to her ancestors, and she wondered if the spirits above were watching, whether the winds of the night would carry her cries into realms unseen. But she was powerless in the moment, a silent witness to her own life being auctioned in secrecy. Even as the carriage rolled away, the town slept. The houses slumbered in oblivion, unaware of the injustice they shielded with their walls. Yet in the corners of that dark night, whispers of spirits seemed to stir. They passed through the leaves, moved with the river's current, and lingered on rooftops. Though invisible to human eyes, they bore witness to the transaction, recording every betrayal and every coin counted. In the shadows, the seeds of retribution began to take root, unnoticed but alive, ready to grow into a fire that would one day consume the hands that had dared treat a human being as nothing more than silver. The household that had purchased her gleamed with wealth, yet behind its polished doors and bright courtyards lurked a different reality. The young woman, now a captive of silver and human greed, quickly realized that freedom was a luxury she would no longer possess. Each day she was given tasks that seemed endless, carrying water from the well, scrubbing floors until her hands were raw, tending to the sprawling gardens under the blazing sun, all while being watched by the sharp eyes of those who considered her nothing more than property. Her movements were monitored, her voice suppressed, and her existence reduced to labor. Food, when it was offered, was sparse and humiliating. She ate in silence, a small portion of what the family themselves consumed, and often went hungry while the household feasted on rich meats and sweet porridge. Her stomach ached, and her body grew thinner with each passing day, yet something within her refused to surrender. Hunger gnawed at her, but it also sharpened her mind and spirit. While her captors sought to weaken her physically, they unknowingly ignited a fire of endurance that burned quietly in her chest. Each day of cruelty became a lesson, each insult a reminder that she had survived worse than fear itself. Her isolation, though oppressive, offered a strange clarity. In the quiet hours before dawn, she would sit by the small window of her chamber, watching the first light spill across the courtyard. The wind carried with it whispers that seemed almost alive, brushing against her ears like the voices of the ancestors. She imagined them observing her, guiding her thoughts, reminding her that suffering alone did not equate to defeat. They spoke in riddles and fragments, urging patience, resilience, and awareness. Though unseen, their presence was tangible. She felt their strength flow into her, mingling with the fire that hunger had begun to kindle. Even in the face of mockery, her spirit refused to bow completely. The household servants and children, some of whom delighted in her misfortune, jeered at her frailty and whispered cruel remarks when her back was turned. Yet she responded not with tears or outbursts but with quiet defiance. Her eyes, though sunken and weary, held a spark that unsettled her oppressors. They could see the thinness of her form, but they could not touch the fire within her gaze. It was as if her very being contained a hidden power, one that hunger and suffering had nurtured rather than destroyed. In the stillness of night, she often dreamed of flames, not destructive ones, but flames that rose from her own body, a fire that consumed not her but the injustice surrounding her. The dreams were vivid, silver melting into rivers of light, greedy hands turning to ash, and herself standing amidst the glow, untouched yet transformed. Each vision strengthened her resolve, reminding her that her captivity was temporary, that the fire would one day answer her call. She also remembered the stories her mother had told her, the tales of ancestors who had walked the land with courage and wisdom. Their voices merged with the whispers of spirits, creating a chorus that spoke of patience and preparation. Survival, they seemed to murmur, is not merely existing, it is gathering strength until the moment of reckoning comes. And so, despite hunger, labor, and mockery, she remained unbroken. The physical suffering could bend her body, but it could not extinguish the fire in her soul, a fire that would one day rise and consume all who had wronged her. In those quiet, oppressive days, the young woman learned to turn suffering into power. She discovered that cruelty and neglect could not touch her spirit, that isolation could sharpen her mind, and that hunger, though a torment, could also awaken a fire of resistance. In the house of the wealthy, surrounded by mockery and deprivation, she became a force quietly taking shape, a storm waiting for the moment to sweep through the world that had betrayed her. The day of the feast arrived with fanfare that echoed throughout the merchant's compound. Drums beat rhythmically in the courtyard, their cadence mingling with the chatter of attendants and the clatter of polished utensils. The air was heavy with the aroma of roasted meats, spiced stews and sweet fruits, a scent meant to seduce and impress the guests. Brightly colored fabrics hung from the rafters, and golden trays gleamed in the sunlight, each carrying delicacies that seemed almost too beautiful to eat. It was a celebration of wealth, a display of abundance, yet in every corner of the compound lay a stark contradiction. The young woman who had been sold into captivity was present only as a silent observer, denied a place at the table, denied even a morsel of the extravagance around her. She sat in the shadows, her posture upright despite the hollowness in her stomach, her eyes tracing every movement with careful attention. Servants poured wine into ornate goblets, laughter erupted as guests complimented the host on his generosity and success, and the merchant himself reclined on a carved chair, his robes heavy with jewels and embroidery. The young woman noted the arrogance in the way he gestured with his hands, the greed in the way his eyes lingered on each piece of silver or gold, and the indulgence in the way they ate without thought, savoring delicacies while the less fortunate were ignored. Each act of excess and mockery of her deprivation fed a growing storm within her. She watched as men argued over the finest cuts of meat and women compared the richness of their garments, all the while unaware of the human suffering that existed in their midst. It was not just her hunger that pained her, but the blatant disregard for humanity, the way joy and abundance were hoarded and flaunted. The fire of injustice stoked itself in her chest. It grew quietly at first, a subtle warmth, but it spread steadily, igniting every memory of betrayal and cruelty. She felt the ancestors' whispers again, brushing against her consciousness, reminding her that every act of arrogance, every indulgence at another's expense, planted seeds that would one day bear reckoning. Even as the feast continued, she found herself noticing details others would miss. The way a guest's laughter was too loud, a mask of pride covering insecurity, the way silver coins were fingered with possessiveness, the careless way servants were treated, their efforts ignored or belittled. Every observation was a lesson of human folly and greed, and with each detail, her resolve strengthened. Hunger had sharpened her senses, isolation had honed her mind, and cruelty had fanned the flames of the inner fire that no lavish meal could smother. Though she received no portion of the food, she did not collapse into despair. Instead, she imagined the feast in her mind as it might have been if justice had been served. In her thoughts, the silver melted into rivers of light, the extravagant garments turned to ash, and the indulgent laughter became cries of accountability. Each vision was a spark, each imagined reversal of fortune a flame that burned brighter than any fire she had seen in the courtyard. The humiliation she endured, the mockery, the visible distinction between wealth and deprivation, was not breaking her, it was forging her. She noticed small things as well, the way shadows flickered across the golden trays, how the wind stirred the hanging fabrics, how the servants' silent glances sometimes carried sympathy, perhaps pity. These little observations became threads she wove into her growing understanding of power and patience. She realized that to act too soon would be foolish. The fire had to grow, tempered by careful attention and strengthened by the injustice she endured. Every bite of food she did not eat, every laugh she was denied, became fuel for a fire that would not be extinguished until the scales of justice were balanced. By the end of the feast, her body ached with hunger, yet her spirit was awake with a sharp intensity. The merchant and his guests had celebrated in ignorance, flaunting wealth and indulgence, but they had also, unwittingly, nurtured the storm that would one day sweep through the town. The young woman rose quietly, unseen, and moved to her chamber. There, in solitude, the fire inside her raged hotter, fanned by every act of arrogance she had witnessed. Hunger had been a teacher, cruelty a mentor, and the feast had planted the seeds of a reckoning that would not wait. She was no longer simply a captive. She was a force growing stronger with every injustice observed, her inner fire preparing for the day it would consume those who had wronged her. In the quiet moments of the night, when the household had fallen into slumber and only the faint flicker of lanterns illuminated the compound, she felt it for the first time, a pulse deep within her chest rising from a place she had not known existed. It was not the fire of anger alone, nor the ache of hunger, but something older, something deeper. The spirits of her ancestors seemed to stir within her, brushing past her skin like a warm wind, whispering truths that no one in the house could perceive. The wind carried their voices into her dreams, and the rustling leaves outside her window spoke in riddles, reminding her that power could grow in silence and patience. She realized that the suffering she had endured, every pang of hunger, every harsh word, every moment of being ignored or mocked, had not weakened her as her captors intended. Instead, it had awakened a force that was entirely her own. Her body may have been frail, thin from lack of nourishment, yet her spirit had grown supple and strong, tempered by the cruelty she had faced. She began to sense a rhythm in the world around her, the sway of trees, the shimmer of moonlight on the river, the heartbeat of the earth beneath the town. Each element seemed to answer to her presence, as though acknowledging that she was no longer merely a girl sold for silver but a vessel of ancestral power and natural energy. This awakening was subtle at first. Her fingertips tingled when she reached out, and shadows seemed to bend toward her when she walked through the hallways. At night, she would dream of fire, not the destructive fire she feared, but a radiant blaze that rose from her own being, strong, controlled, and purposeful. In these visions, she watched herself stand tall before her captors, her eyes glowing, her voice carrying authority over the winds, and every injustice bending beneath her will. These dreams were more than imagination, they were instruction, a blueprint for what would come. Hunger, which once felt like a tormentor, now became a catalyst. Each empty stomach pang fueled the mystical energy coursing within her, turning deprivation into a quiet blaze. The unfairness of her treatment, the mockery she endured, the greed she observed in every face at the feast, all of it became fuel for a fire that would not be contained. It was not a fire of vengeance in the ordinary sense, but a spiritual reckoning, a force that drew upon the invisible threads of nature and the echoes of her ancestors' wisdom. Even as she discovered this power, she remained careful. She did not act impulsively, for she understood that power without control could consume its wielder. The merchant, his family, and the townspeople were oblivious to what was growing within her. They believed she was a fragile, obedient girl, bound by fear and circumstance. Little did they know that with every laugh they shared, every coin they counted, every bite they devoured without thought, they were unknowingly nurturing the force that would one day rise against them. Hints of what was to come stirred the night air. Windows rattled slightly as she walked past. The wind carried whispers that seemed to echo her thoughts. A candle flame flickered toward her as if drawn by an unseen current. Each small sign was a foreshadowing, a subtle reminder that her return to the town would not be ordinary. The girl sold for silver was no longer powerless. She was becoming something that could not be ignored, something that would make the town reckon with its own greed and cruelty. The fire inside her, born of hunger and injustice, was growing steadily, preparing for the moment when patience would transform into judgment. And so, in the still darkness, she embraced the awakening, feeling the pulse of energy as it entwined with her own heartbeat. It was quiet yet undeniable, a mystical force, ancient and alive, waiting for the time to rise. Her captivity had forged her into a vessel of power, and soon the town that had dismissed her as a commodity would discover that some fires, once awakened, cannot be extinguished by wealth, mockery, or fear. The first hints of dawn painted the horizon with streaks of gold and crimson as she approached the outskirts of the town. Her journey back had been long, through thick forests and over winding paths, each step a reminder of the suffering she had endured and the strength she had cultivated. No longer the fragile girl sold for silver, she now moved with purpose, her every step carrying the weight of power that had been awakened within her. The wind seemed to respond to her presence, brushing against her like a living cloak, and the distant cries of birds rose and fell as though marking her passage. From afar the town appeared unchanged. Its streets were bustling with morning commerce, merchants shouting their wares and children running between stalls, oblivious to the storm that approached. The marketplace glittered in the rising sun, silver coins clinking in the hands of those who still prized wealth above all else. Yet, hidden beneath the familiar facade of prosperity, the town remained blind to the danger that now walked toward its center. The same hands that had ignored her pain, that had laughed at her captivity, were unaware that their time of reckoning had arrived. She paused for a moment on a hill overlooking the town, taking in the view. Every roof, every doorway, every street corner held memories of betrayal and cruelty. The faces of those who had sold her, who had smiled while counting coins, flickered in her mind like ghosts. But they were no longer just memories, they were sparks feeding the fire that now burned fiercely within her. Her body, though still slender, exuded a presence that seemed to bend the air, and her eyes, once dimmed by despair, now blazed with an unyielding light. As she descended toward the main road, a quiet tension settled over the scene. The birds, once singing freely, fell silent for a moment, and even the wind seemed to pause as though holding its breath. Her approach was unnoticed by the townspeople, yet the energy she carried caused subtle disturbances. Lantern flames flickered in the windows, leaves stirred without wind, and shadows lengthened unnaturally along the cobblestones. Every step drew her closer to the heart of the town, where betrayal had been most concentrated, and the anticipation of confrontation thrummed through her veins like a living drumbeat. She remembered the feast, the laughter of the merchants, the sneers of her family, and the cruel glances of neighbors who had dismissed her suffering as fate. Each recollection became fuel for the mystical fire within her, strengthening the resolve that had been nurtured by hunger, labor, and isolation. Though no one in the town could yet perceive it, the energy that accompanied her presence began to ripple outward, a silent warning to the guilty and an invisible shield for those who had shown kindness. Passing familiar streets, she noted the same people who had once ignored her, still caught in the rhythms of daily life, still blind to the consequences of their actions. Their laughter and bargaining rang hollow now, as if the echoes themselves sensed the inevitability of what was coming. She moved deliberately, with measured steps, fully aware of the power that she wielded, and the time that had come to balance the scales. The fire inside her was no longer a secret. It was a force coiled tightly, waiting to erupt, and with each step she drew nearer to the streets where betrayal had once thrived, where greed had been celebrated, and where the reckoning would finally unfold. In that quiet yet charged moment, she realized that her return was not merely a physical journey. It was a passage from victimhood to power, from suffering to vengeance, and from invisibility to inevitability. The town, unaware of the storm approaching, continued its ordinary rhythm, blind to the extraordinary force advancing among them. The girl sold for silver was no longer a powerless pawn. She was the fire itself, and the streets of the town, the very center of betrayal, were about to bear witness to the fury that had been silently growing within her for years. As night fell over the town, the young woman stepped onto the cobblestone streets with purpose. The air was cool, carrying the sense of roasting spices and faint smoke from hearth fires, ordinary to the townspeople who had no inkling of the extraordinary force approaching. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the fire within her simmered, fueled by years of betrayal, hunger, and injustice. It began as a subtle heat, almost imperceptible, but with every step, it grew, spreading through her body and radiating outward, a warning invisible to all but the spirits who watched in quiet anticipation. The first sign of her power came in the marketplace, where merchants flaunted their silver and counted coins with careless arrogance. Flames, small and flickering at first, appeared along the edges of wooden stalls, licking the corners of barrels and crates. The fire obeyed her will, choosing its targets with precision. Greed and deceit became the fuel, innocence spared. The traders, initially unaware, continued their calculations and laughter, until a warm glow reflected in their eyes, not from the lanterns but from the unnatural fire that danced along the ground. Confusion turned to panic as they realized the flames did not consume indiscriminately. The silver they prized so dearly seemed now to invite judgment. From one end of the street to the other, the fire leapt with eerie intelligence. Homes of those complicit in her sale flickered with heat, the wood groaning as it surrendered to the blaze. Windows shattered, splintered doors swung open, and screams echoed as the guilty were engulfed, their faces frozen in shock and terror. The young woman's eyes blazed with an unearthly light as she walked past, a calm amid the chaos she had unleashed. She did not strike blindly, she had waited, observed, and now delivered a reckoning that was as meticulous as it was unstoppable. In the alleys, the smell of smoke mingled with the panic of the townspeople. Children clung to their mothers, unaware of the source of the fire, while the elders, long accustomed to measuring the value of gold over human life, began to understand too late the consequences of their arrogance. The fire moved like a predator with a purpose, engulfing the rich and deceitful first, those who had laughed at her, ignored her suffering, or actively participated in her betrayal. The silver that once symbolized prosperity now reflected their doom, a cruel mirror of the greed that had shaped the town's sins. The town square became a theater of judgment. Merchants fell to their knees, begging, praying, and screaming, yet the flames did not relent. Rich fabrics caught fire, coins melted and sizzled, and the wooden beams of homes collapsed in crackling defiance. The fire did not touch those who had shown kindness or sympathy. The innocent looked on in awe and fear, understanding that the young woman had become more than mortal. She was a force, a living embodiment of justice drawn from the pain inflicted upon her. Even the streets themselves seemed to respond to her anger. Cobblestones glimmered as though reflecting her inner fire, and the air shimmered with heat and energy. Smoke twisted into shapes, almost like watching spirits dance around her, bearing witness to the reckoning. The people who had dismissed her, who had sold her for silver and feigned ignorance of cruelty, now faced the reality of their choices. Every scream, every collapse, every glow of flame mirrored the fire she carried within, a power no coin could contain, no denial could suppress. By the time the fire had consumed its first wave of targets, the town was unrecognizable. Shops were reduced to ash, homes smoldered, and streets were littered with remnants of greed turned to ruin. Villagers who had once scorned her or ignored her plight now whispered in terror, the legend of the girl sold for silver already taking root in their minds. The fire, both literal and mystical, had transformed her suffering into a tangible force of judgment, and the world around her was forced to acknowledge that injustice, no matter how well hidden, always invites retribution. As she paused in the heart of the town, surrounded by the flickering glow of devastation, the weight of her power settled within her. She did not gloat, nor did she falter. The fire had served its purpose. The greedy had been punished, the deceitful exposed, and the complicit reminded that human cruelty carries consequences. The town, once indifferent to suffering and blind to injustice, now bore the marks of reckoning. And in that moment the young woman understood fully that the fire she wielded was not just vengeance. It was a balance, a force drawn from years of pain, ready to ensure that no silver could ever again measure the worth of a human soul. As the fire raged through the streets, consuming the greedy and complicit, a remarkable pattern became clear. Those who had shown kindness even in the smallest ways were untouched. Families who had offered her a smile, a helping hand, or a moment of compassion watched in awe as their homes remained intact, their possessions unharmed. The mystical flames recognized innocence, respect, and empathy, sparing those whose hearts had not been corrupted by greed. The town, once uniform in its outward appearance of wealth and order, now revealed its hidden moral landscape in the flickering light. The young woman moved through the chaos with purpose, her eyes scanning each figure she passed. She could sense the energy of her ancestors guiding her, steering the fire toward those who deserved punishment while leaving the virtuous unharmed. In this way the fire became not only a force of vengeance but a tool of revelation. Streets that had once been scenes of daily trade and communal life now displayed a map of moral consequence. Homes reduced to ash marked betrayal, while others, untouched, marked compassion or neutrality. The very town became a lesson, carved in flames and smoke for all to see. Among the spared, relief mingled with fear. Mothers clutched their children, elders whispered prayers of thanks, and neighbors who had silently aided her in small, unnoticed ways now realized the significance of their quiet actions. They had acted not out of heroism, but from instinctive decency, returning water to her when she was left thirsty, sharing bread when she had gone hungry, or simply speaking words of encouragement when others jeered. Their kindness, however slight, had created a shield that the fire recognized. It was as though the spirits themselves had marked them, leaving them untouched to witness the reckoning unfold around them. Meanwhile, those who had ignored her plight but had not actively harmed her found themselves in a liminal state. Their homes were untouched, yet their hearts quivered with guilt and fear. They had known of the injustice, even if only peripherally, and their inaction had made them complicit in a subtle way. The fire did not consume them, but the weight of the lesson bore heavily upon their conscience. They watched neighbors' homes collapse, merchants' wealth melt into ash, and streets erupt with screams of those who had betrayed the young woman. The sight forced reflection. Cruelty can hide behind polite smiles and greed can wear the mask of normalcy, but divine or ancestral justice, as embodied in her fire, sees all. The children of the town, eyes wide and tearful, clung to their parents and whispered questions about the fire that seemed alive. "Why is our home safe, Mama?" one asked, his small voice trembling. Mothers, unsure how to explain, could only point to the girl walking through the streets, radiating calm and control, and say, "It is because she is fair, the fire knows the hearts of people." The truth of the moment was undeniable. The flames did not simply punish indiscriminately, they judged with precision, guided by forces beyond mortal comprehension. It was a display of ancestral wisdom and justice, ancient as the land itself, reminding the townspeople that human cruelty carries consequences, and kindness is always seen, even when ignored by others. Families who had helped her in the past felt a surge of humility and gratitude. They whispered to one another, recounting times when they had offered small acts of mercy and noting how those simple gestures had become lifelines in a larger cosmic reckoning. Conversely, those who had celebrated her suffering, who had laughed at her dehumanization, now faced the devastation they had earned. Homes reduced to embers, prized possessions lost to the flames, and bodies scorched or fleeing in terror created a stark contrast. In that moment, the town itself became a living parable. Wealth and status are meaningless without virtue, and cruelty carries a price that no human cunning can evade. As the fire spread, it became clear that its purpose was not purely destruction but instruction. Villagers who survived stared in shock at the clear delineation between guilt and innocence. Even those who had turned a blind eye to her suffering recognized the subtle distinctions. Some were spared, others punished. Every flame, every wisp of smoke carried a lesson. People whispered of spirits, of ancestors, of divine forces enforcing justice in ways that human hands could not. The fire had revealed what had been hidden for years, that cruelty and betrayal could exist behind smiles and polished doors, but justice, once awakened, is inescapable. The young woman walked through the town with calm certainty, her eyes reflecting the glow of the flames that consumed only the guilty. She saw neighbors bowing their heads, merchants trembling in disbelief, and children staring wide-eyed at the spectacle. It was a scene of reckoning, yes, but also of revelation. The town had been forced to confront its own moral failings, to recognize that hidden cruelty, even when unnoticed by ordinary eyes, does not go unseen by ancestral or spiritual forces. By the end of the night, the streets were transformed. Homes of the corrupt lay in ruin, shops of the greedy had burned to ash, and the echoes of screams filled the air. Meanwhile, the innocent, who had acted with compassion or even silent neutrality, remained unharmed. They bore witness to the outcome, their hearts heavy with both fear and understanding. In the quiet aftermath, the villagers whispered to one another of the girls sold for silver and the fire that had judged without bias. They understood now, as they never had before, that actions, small and large, hidden or visible, carry consequences, and that divine or ancestral justice has a way of revealing the truth, consuming only what deserves to burn, and leaving the righteous to carry the memory forward. As the first light of dawn touched the scorched rooftops and smoldering streets, the young woman emerged from the ruins like a figure carved from the flames themselves. The town, once bustling with the careless chatter of merchants and the laughter of children, now lay silent in awe and fear. Smoke curled lazily from collapsed homes, ash drifted along the cobblestone streets, and the stench of burnt greed lingered in the air. Amidst this devastation she stood tall, not in physical strength, for her body remained frail from years of hunger and suffering, but in presence. Her eyes burned with a fierce authority that no cruelty could diminish, and her posture radiated resilience forged in the fires of injustice. Every step she took was deliberate, a measured declaration that she had endured the unimaginable and emerged not broken but awakened. Villagers who had once dismissed her, who had whispered behind closed doors or counted her as nothing more than silver, now watched in silence. Their faces were pale, etched with the shock of realizing that the girl they had underestimated was no ordinary human being. She carried the weight of ancestral power, the quiet energy of the natural world, and the cumulative force of every injustice inflicted upon her. It was a presence that demanded acknowledgement and respect, a living testament to the idea that suffering, when endured with dignity and patience, can transform into unshakable strength. Her frailty was deceptive. The thinness of her frame, a reminder of the hunger she had endured, made the intensity of her eyes even more striking. They burned not with blind anger but with the fire of purpose and discernment. Each glance seemed to scan the hearts of those who looked upon her, measuring guilt and innocence, power and humility. Even as the townspeople whispered to one another in fear, the young woman did not need to speak. Her presence alone conveyed the weight of the lessons she carried, the judgment that had already fallen, and the authority she now commanded over a town that had once treated her as a commodity. As she moved through the streets, villagers fell back instinctively, murmuring her name as though speaking it aloud might summon the very fire that had destroyed the greedy. The whispers spread quickly, "It is her, the girl sold for silver, she has returned." Mothers clutched their children closer, merchants and elders bowed their heads, and even those who had been spared felt a deep, reverent respect. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a symbol of consequence and endurance, a cautionary figure whose story would be carried for generations. Amidst the ruins she observed the remnants of her oppressors' lives: collapsed homes, melted silver and ruined possessions. It was a scene of destruction, but it was also a scene of revelation. Each building consumed, each object destroyed, told the story of the choices they had made, the greed they had pursued, and the cruelty they had inflicted. And yet she did not gloat. Her authority was not rooted in malice but in the undeniable balance she had restored. The fire she carried, mystical and relentless, had executed judgment with precision, sparing the innocent and punishing only those whose hearts had been corrupt. The villagers, though terrified, began to understand the message that had been delivered. Actions, no matter how small or hidden, have consequences. The young woman's emergence was more than a return. It was a revelation of the hidden truths within their community. People whispered of her endurance, of the strength she had gathered from hunger, suffering, and injustice, and of the mystical power that had transformed her into something both human and otherworldly. The fire that had destroyed the guilty had not consumed her. It had forged her, making her both survivor and arbiter of justice. Even the children who had watched from doorways or hiding behind parents' skirts sensed the shift in the air. They saw not only a survivor but a figure of legend, someone whose life had been shaped by cruelty yet elevated by resilience and moral clarity. Stories would be told of her for generations: the girl who had been sold for silver, the fire that had consumed the wicked, and the emergence of a young woman whose spirit could not be broken. Her name, whispered with awe, became synonymous with endurance, courage, and the inexorable force of justice. As she paused at the center of the town square, the remnants of smoke curling around her, a hush fell over the crowd. It was a moment suspended in time, the quiet after the storm, when the balance between cruelty and consequence had been restored. She looked at the townspeople, her gaze steady and commanding, and the reality of her presence settled into their minds. The girl they had treated as property was now a force beyond measure. She had returned from suffering not merely as a survivor but as a living legend, a reminder that injustice, no matter how hidden, always leaves its mark and always invites retribution. And so, amidst the ruins she stood, a frail body housing an indomitable spirit, eyes alight with the fire of resilience, her name etched into the collective memory of the town. The villagers whispered, half in fear, half in reverence, passing the story from one to another. She was the survivor, the warning, and the embodiment of the truth that even the weakest, when forged by injustice, can rise to command power and exact the reckoning long overdue. In her emergence, the town saw the full measure of human consequence, and the young woman became legend, her life a testament to endurance, justice, and the unstoppable fire that hunger and cruelty had unwittingly awakened. In the quiet aftermath of the destruction, as smoke lingered over the streets and the townspeople began to sift through the ruins, the story of the young woman sold for silver became more than just whispered fear. It became a living lesson, a moral carved into the very fabric of the town. Her journey from victimhood to unstoppable force was a stark reminder that greed and betrayal against the innocent are never without consequences. Families who had once prioritized wealth over compassion now understood, in the deepest part of their hearts, that the smallest acts of cruelty can summon reckoning beyond human control. The memory of the fire that had consumed only the guilty was seared into every mind, ensuring that no one could dismiss the lesson as coincidence or chance. From that day forward, the town's festivals, markets, and daily rituals began to reflect a profound shift in values. Where once abundance had been hoarded by a select few, now food was shared freely. Long tables appeared in the town square during harvest celebrations, laden not only with bread, roasted meats, and fruit but with the deliberate intention that no one would go hungry. The elders who had once ignored her suffering, taught children the importance of generosity, fairness, and protection of the vulnerable. The fire that had consumed greed now lived in the practices of the people, transforming fear into vigilance and compassion. Town rituals changed as well. Where money and silver had once dictated status, the merit of one's character now held weight. Annual ceremonies were established to honor the weak, the kind-hearted, and those who acted with integrity, regardless of wealth or social standing. Songs were sung about the girl sold for silver, not only recounting the destruction she had wrought but emphasizing the strength, endurance, and justice she embodied. Children grew up hearing these stories, learning that cruelty, whether through action or silence, never escapes notice and that courage, patience, and moral fortitude are treasures far more valuable than silver. The fire she had wielded was no longer simply her own. It became symbolic, an eternal reminder of justice. Statues, carvings, and murals began to appear throughout the town, depicting her with eyes blazing, walking among flames that spared the innocent. These images were intended not to instill fear for fear's sake, but to instill awareness, to remind all who saw them that the community itself was accountable to standards higher than wealth, higher than tradition, and higher than convenience. The fire of her power, born of suffering and injustice, had become the moral compass of the town, guiding every act of kindness, every decision to protect the vulnerable, and every gesture of shared humanity. The villagers, reflecting on the events, came to realize that the young woman's journey was both personal and collective. It was not merely her vengeance that transformed the town, but the moral awakening it inspired. Parents instructed children to notice suffering in others, to act when injustice threatened, and to respect the power inherent in human dignity. Merchants, once preoccupied with profit above all else, began to balance their wealth with ethical responsibility, understanding that the greed which had once invited fire could never be ignored again. The fire of her reckoning became a spiritual presence, a cultural memory woven into the town's identity. Stories spread beyond the town's borders as well, carried by travelers and traders who had witnessed the aftermath. Neighboring villages learned of the girl sold for silver, of the fire that consumed the guilty, and of the transformation that followed. Her legend became a cautionary tale, repeated across regions, each retelling emphasizing the lessons learned. Wealth does not protect the wicked, cruelty against the innocent summons justice, and moral courage, even in the weakest, can ignite change more powerful than any sword or coin. Her narrative became a cultural cornerstone, guiding behavior, inspiring caution, and reminding communities that actions always carry consequences, no matter how hidden they seem. Even generations later, the story remained alive in ritual and memory. During festivals, children would reenact her journey in plays and songs, portraying both her suffering and her strength. Candles were lit in her honor, representing the fire that had exacted justice, and elders would remind the young that the girl who had been sold for silver had transformed pain into power, injustice into guidance, and suffering into moral clarity. Her name became synonymous with the idea that those who act unjustly cannot escape judgment, and that even those who appear powerless hold potential for extraordinary influence. In every street, in every family, and in every act of remembrance, her legacy endured. The fire she had wielded continued to live on, not as a destructive force, but as a symbol of balance and accountability. Children hearing the story for the first time learned the importance of fairness, empathy, and courage. Adults, reflecting on the past, carried the lessons into daily life, ensuring that greed and betrayal would never again overshadow justice and compassion. The girl sold for silver had returned, her presence eternal in the collective memory of the town, a cautionary figure whose story illuminated the path toward righteousness, fairness, and the enduring power of moral courage. Years passed, yet the story of the girl sold for silver refused to fade. Her journey, her suffering, and her extraordinary return became etched into the memory of the town, carried forward not merely in whispers but in song, chant, and ritualized storytelling. Each generation retold her tale, adding nuance, rhythm, and voice to ensure that her lesson, about the consequences of greed and betrayal, remained alive and vivid. The fire she had wielded was no longer just a historical event. It had transformed into a living, breathing symbol, a reminder of the power of justice, courage, and resilience. In the mornings, children gathered around elders, their eyes wide with curiosity, as verses of her story were sung in melodic chants. They learned of her sale for silver, the cruelty she endured, and the mystical fire that punished the guilty while sparing the innocent. The lyrics emphasized moral clarity, that no act of injustice goes unnoticed, that greed invites reckoning, and that even the weakest can rise to power when guided by righteousness. Through song, the young absorbed lessons not as abstract ideas, but as a tangible part of their world. Every verse served as both education and warning, ensuring the memory of her life would mold their behavior and choices. The chants were not monotonous repetitions. They carried emotion, drama, and imagery that captured the essence of her experiences. Elders would use different tones to evoke her suffering, the fire's wrath, and the awe-inspiring transformation of the town. Children felt the sorrow, fear, and ultimately the triumph embedded in every word. Storytelling sessions often included gestures, reenactments, and even symbolic fire representations to illustrate her power and the consequences of cruelty. These performances created a living connection between past and present, transforming the abstract notion of justice into a vivid, memorable experience for every listener. Beyond children, the town itself absorbed the lessons into daily life. Merchants incorporated elements of her story into their morning greetings, reminding each other and customers alike that fairness and empathy were valued above wealth and cunning. During festivals, songs celebrating her life and justice became central to communal celebrations, reinforcing a culture of shared responsibility and ethical conduct. Her legend influenced decision-making, governance, and social interaction, as every act of kindness or fairness was measured against the benchmark of her story. Even adults who had witnessed her return spoke of her in hushed reverence, retelling episodes of the mystical fire with awe, ensuring that no generation forgot the magnitude of her power or the precision of her judgment. Travelers and neighboring communities soon adopted these songs as well, and her tale spread far beyond the town where she had lived. Her story became a regional folk narrative, adapted into rhythms, chants, and instruments that reflected local traditions. Each performance carried the core truths. Injustice leads to reckoning, resilience transforms suffering into power, and moral courage leaves an enduring legacy. Her legend became a tool for teaching empathy and respect, providing a framework for societal ethics that transcended time and geography. Over generations, the song became more than history, it became a moral compass. Villagers recited it at weddings, harvests, and communal gatherings, ensuring that every child, from the moment they could speak, absorbed the principles her life had embodied. They learned that cruelty, greed, and betrayal have consequences beyond immediate understanding, while kindness, patience, and moral courage are recognized by forces that shape the world in ways humans might not fully see. Her tale, now living folklore, became inseparable from the cultural identity of the community, a continual reinforcement of justice, respect, and ethical behavior. Even as centuries passed, the fire she had wielded remained alive in every chant and story. Children hearing the verses felt the tremor of awe, and adults found themselves reflecting on the moral weight of their actions. The girl sold for silver had transcended mortality, becoming an enduring symbol of ethical vigilance, resilience, and the unstoppable force of justice. Through song, memory, and ritual, her legend ensured that no one would ever forget the lessons of greed, betrayal, and the transformative power of righteous fire. Years after the flames had consumed the greedy and spared the innocent, the town began to rebuild itself. The streets, once blackened by fire and ash, gradually took on new life. Homes were reconstructed, markets reopened, and laughter slowly returned to the squares where panic and terror had once reigned. But the town was no longer the same. Every stone, every doorway, every pathway carried the memory of the fire and the young woman who had wielded it. Her presence, though no longer physically visible, lingered as a spiritual guide, shaping the behaviors, ethics, and decisions of every survivor and every child who would grow to inhabit the town. The rebuilding process was deliberate and careful. Families discussed openly the choices they had made, the acts of cruelty they had committed, and the ways in which they had ignored or participated in injustice. Survivors shared their memories of the girl sold for silver, recalling the fear in her eyes, the silent suffering she endured, and the unstoppable force of her return. They spoke not only of the devastation she had wrought upon the guilty but also of the mercy embedded in her fire, how innocence had been spared and compassion recognized. Each story was repeated, refined, and passed down, ensuring that the lessons of greed, betrayal, and moral vigilance became embedded in the collective consciousness of the community. Children hearing these stories learned to see beyond appearances. They understood that wealth, silver, and outward prosperity meant little without ethical behavior, empathy, and justice. They were taught that cruelty, whether overt or hidden, carries consequences, and that enduring hardship with courage can awaken strength beyond human comprehension. The fire that had once destroyed the greedy became a metaphor for accountability, a spiritual reminder that shaped daily life. Parents emphasized that honesty, kindness, and attentiveness to the suffering of others were essential virtues, and the children absorbed these values naturally, repeating the chants, songs, and tales that kept the memory alive. The town's festivals, now infused with the moral weight of the girl's story, became ceremonies of reflection as well as celebration. Harvests were no longer solely for feasting and display. They included rituals of sharing, remembrance, and recognition of those who had suffered in the past. Candles were lit in memory of the fire, and moments of silence were observed for the lives changed by greed and cruelty. Even merchants adjusted their practices, balancing commerce with responsibility, ensuring that no transaction, no matter how profitable, could harm the vulnerable. The culture of the town had been fundamentally transformed, guided by the spiritual fire that refused to be forgotten. Elders took an active role in recounting the events to each new generation. They would sit children in circles in the squares, using vivid imagery to illustrate the fire's selective power. They told of the frail young woman who had endured starvation and betrayal, who had returned not as a victim but as a force of moral reckoning. They described the streets engulfed in flames that only consumed the guilty, and the compassion and vigilance that had spared the innocent. These lessons were reinforced with visual symbols: murals of the girl walking amidst fire, carvings depicting acts of kindness, and ceremonial enactments that dramatized the story. Through these repeated rituals, the town ensured that the memory of justice remained present in the hearts and minds of its people. Survivors reflected not only on the past but also on the responsibilities they now carried. They realized that the fire of justice was not simply a historical event but a spiritual guide, an ongoing influence that demanded conscious effort to maintain balance, fairness, and empathy in all interactions. They understood that ignoring injustice, tolerating cruelty, or prioritizing greed above human dignity could invite disaster. The young woman's story became a lens through which every decision was measured, every act of charity amplified, and every act of cruelty scrutinized. The fire, once literal, had transformed into a force of moral conscience. Even decades later, villagers reported feeling her presence in subtle ways, a breeze that seemed to guide the lost child to safety, a warm light in the hearth that symbolized protection, or a sudden awareness of wrongs being corrected. The spiritual fire that had once physically manifested now acted as an invisible guide, shaping behavior, inspiring courage, and maintaining vigilance against injustice. Her legend ensured that the town would never forget the lessons of the past, that children would grow up understanding the consequences of cruelty, and that adults would continue to uphold values of justice, fairness, and moral courage. The town became known far and wide not only for its prosperity but for its integrity. Travelers marveled at the rituals of remembrance, the songs of the girl sold for silver, and the community's commitment to protecting the weak. Visitors left with stories of the fire that had burned greed, and of a survivor whose endurance had become a beacon of ethical guidance. In this way, her tale transcended time, becoming both a historical account and a living moral compass, ensuring that the lessons of suffering, courage, and justice would never be lost. Through the careful rebuilding of the town, the stories, and the rituals, the fire of justice lived on. It shaped every action, every decision, and every tradition, reminding all that human greed and betrayal are always witnessed, always remembered, and always accounted for. The young woman, once a victim, had become an enduring symbol of endurance, justice, and the transformative power of righteous fire, a guide for generations ensuring that history with all its lessons would not repeat itself.